There comes a time in every soul's journey when the silence speaks louder than the shouting ever did. Is not the storm that awakens you, but the stillness after it. That aching, sacred pause when you realize that what you've been calling love was really a slow disappearance of yourself. You see, the great tragedy of relationships with narcissists is not merely that they harm, it is that they do so with your permission, cloaked in the false garments of connection, romance, or kinship. But God does not create us to be swallowed by others' illusions. He creates us in His image, with the breath of truth in our lungs and the flame of dignity in our chest. And there comes a day divinely appointed when the soul stirs from its sleep, not with a shout, but with a whisper. This is not who I am. This is not what I was made for. The narcissist never expects that moment. They never imagine the day when the one they've silenced finds their voice again, when the one they've diminished begins to rise. They bet everything on your compliance, your confusion, your fear. But what they forget, what they always forget, is that even the most wounded heart still remembers the sound of truth. And when that sound breaks through the fog, it doesn't just set you free, it dismantles the entire fortress of lies built on your silence. This message is for that moment, for the soul that has awakened and now stands at the edge of a great returning. Not to the narcissist, but to yourself. Let us begin. The shock of your awakening, the collapse of their illusion. It is a holy and haunting thing when a soul remembers its name. For years, perhaps decades, you played a role you never auditioned for, a part written not in truth but in manipulation, not by God but by a person who feared the light of authenticity. You became the peacekeeper, the forgiver, the one who explained away cruelty with, "They're just hurting." You tolerated the chaos not because you were blind, but because your heart was trained, perhaps by childhood, by faith, or by fear, to believe that endurance was love and sacrifice meant salvation. But endurance apart from truth becomes erasure, and sacrifice, when demanded instead of offered, becomes spiritual abuse. The narcissist never expected you to awaken, because your very sleep was their structure. They fed on your self-doubt, on your instinct to make things work, on your hesitance to cause pain. They assumed that your kindness would always silence your voice, that your love would always override your logic, that you would remain not because you were content, but because you were conditioned. And for a time they were right, until one day, without a bang or a blaze, something shifted, not outside you, but within, a whisper louder than the lies, a flicker stronger than the fog. Something ancient and eternal stirred. Your soul remembered. It did not rise in vengeance, but in vision. It did not scream, but it no longer apologized. And that shift, the moment you stopped justifying what you knew was wrong, was not just a change in behavior. It was the beginning of a collapse. Not yours, but theirs. Because the narcissist world is not built on truth. It is built on perception, on performance, on your compliance. And when you stop playing the part, when you take off the costume they stitched with blame and silence, their entire stage begins to tremble. You see, their strength was never real. It was borrowed. Borrowed from your uncertainty, from your habit of peacekeeping at any cost, from your willingness to absorb their chaos as your responsibility. They are not afraid of you leaving the room. They are afraid of you seeing the room, of realizing that the walls were made of gaslight and the windows were painted shut with guilt, that the roof above you wasn't protection, it was control. They are not threatened by distance, they are threatened by discernment, because discernment means you no longer confuse their dysfunction with your duty. When you awaken, they feel it, not intellectually, but existentially, not as a disagreement, but as danger. because your awakening doesn't just free you, it exposes them. And exposure is unbearable to a heart that has spent a lifetime hiding behind charm and tragedy and justifications. You are no longer speaking their script. You are no longer bowing at the altar of their emotional storms. You are no longer shrinking to fit their fragile ego. And in that moment, without lifting a finger, you've done the very thing they never imagined. You've remembered that you were never created to be small. You've remembered that your worth is not negotiated in silence but declared in truth. You've remembered that you are not the cause of their brokenness, and you are not the cure. And that remembering, that is the earthquake, that is the revolution, that is the mercy of God pulling you from illusion and setting your feet on sacred, solid ground. They expected your fear, but what they got was your freedom. But we must go deeper, because the true betrayal, in their eyes, is not your departure. It is your transformation. Your transformation dismantles the script they wrote for you. The narcissist never loved you. They loved the version of you they could control. Long before you realized you were being diminished, they had already written your role in their narrative. It was subtle, like fog slowly filling a room. You weren't handed a script, you were conditioned into one. They studied your heart, not to protect it, but to exploit it. They observed your empathy, your mercy, your willingness to forgive, and they mistook it for permission to harm. They were not writing a love story, they were directing a play, one where they starred as both hero and victim, and you were cast as the supporting character, eternally self-sacrificing, always one apology away from disappearing entirely. But here's the holy truth. The soul can only pretend for so long before the image of God within it cries out. Your transformation didn't come to please them, it came to preserve you. It began the moment you chose discomfort over denial, the moment you said no and didn't flinch, the moment you stopped editing your voice for the sake of peace and started speaking with the authority of someone created in truth. And it was that choice, not your distance, not your defiance, that tore their story apart. Because their script depended on your predictability. They choreographed every argument, every manipulation, every apology they never meant, around the assumption that you would remain who you were, pliable, forgiving, afraid of conflict. They crafted scenes in which your silence was the applause that validated their performance, and suddenly, without warning, you stopped clapping. That single refusal, that holy disruption, is what dismantled the entire theater. They say, you've changed, and they're right, but not in the way they accuse. You have changed, not into someone new, but into someone true. You have not become cold, you have become clear. You have not become cruel, you have become conscious. You have not lost your empathy, you have learned to aim it wisely. And in that clarity, you break the fourth wall of their illusion. You speak lines not from the script, but from your soul. You begin to ask questions they don't want to answer. You set boundaries they cannot bypass. You no longer play along with the unspoken rule. Keep the narcissist comfortable, even if it costs you everything. And in that moment, when you no longer dance to the rhythm of their dysfunction, you expose the lie they built their power upon. This is why your transformation is intolerable to them, because it doesn't just alter the relationship, it invalidates their reality. You are no longer the one who apologizes first. You are no longer the one who makes excuses for their cruelty. You are no longer available to be blamed, gaslit, or erased. And that, to a narcissist, is not rejection, it is annihilation. Because without your role in their story, the story collapses. But hear me, their collapse is not your responsibility. Their panic is not your burden. Their unraveling is not your fault. Your only responsibility now is to keep walking in the truth, no matter how loudly they beg for your return to the fantasy. You do not owe the illusion another moment of your life, because once you awaken, once you remember who you are and whose you are no longer part of their fiction. You are writing your own book now, and this chapter is called Freedom. If this was the moment you stopped clapping, if you felt the shift in your spirit, comment below with the words, "I've returned to myself." Let the world know your voice is back. But the story doesn't end with transformation. It continues with revelation, a revelation not just of who you are, but where you've been trapped. The fortress they built was never a home. It was a prison. To the unsuspecting heart, control often wears the mask of care. Manipulation mimics concern, and what begins as affection slowly calcifies into architecture, an architecture not built for love, but for dominion. The narcissist, at first, appears to offer refuge. They charm, they mirror, they study you, not like a sacred mystery to be cherished, but like a puzzle to be solved for personal gain. And what they learn, they use. Your empathy becomes the first brick, your gentleness the second, your reluctance to walk away the foundation. They do not build homes, they build fortresses, structures designed not for shelter, but for containment. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you become trapped within it. At first it feels like safety. Their attention, their intensity, their need for you, it all feels like connection, but connection is mutual. What they offer is not shared life, it is psychological occupation. Their fortress becomes a place where your identity is dismantled, not violently, but methodically. You are no longer known, you are managed. Your boundaries are not respected. They are mapped so they can be bypassed. Your wounds are not healed. They are studied so they can be reopened when needed. Inside this fortress, everything is conditional. Love is given not as a gift, but as leverage. Affection is rationed, doled out as reward for your submission. Silence is expected. Agreement is worship. Doubt is sin. And slowly, without knowing how it happened, you find yourself adapting not to love, but to survival. You learn which words are safe, which emotions will provoke coldness, which truths must be swallowed so the walls don't shake. You learn that peace doesn't mean wholeness, it means compliance. That your needs are disruptions, that your voice is dangerous, and still you stay. Because the fortress is convincing. It has windows with painted-on sunlight. It has rooms labeled love and family and commitment. It echoes with words you long to hear, but none of them are lived. They are props. The fortress is not real in its love. It is only real in its rules. And every rule is designed to shrink you. But the soul cannot remain in confinement forever. Even in the smallest cell, there is something eternal that stirs. A whisper from heaven that says, "You were not made for this." And that whisper grows louder with each betrayal, each half-truth, each demand that you betray yourself in the name of peace, until one day the pain of staying becomes greater than the fear of leaving. And when you finally walk out, perhaps shaking, perhaps weeping, it is not just the walls you leave behind, it is the lie that you were safe there, that you were seen, that you were loved. Because real love does not demand imprisonment. It does not reduce or erase. It enlarges. It liberates. It bears truth, even when truth is inconvenient. And so you walk, not away from love, but toward it, toward the unshackled light of a God who never asked you to stay small to keep someone else from feeling insecure, a God who does not manipulate through guilt but restores through grace, a God who says, I have not given you a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. That fortress was never your home, it was your test. And now, in the freedom of clarity, you begin to remember how to build again. Not with fear, not with walls, but with truth and dignity and peace that doesn't demand the death of your identity. And though you escape the structure, something still lingers, the cost. Because clarity always comes at a price. The true cost of clarity, grief, not just relief. Clarity is not the absence of pain, it is often the doorway to it. There is a sacred deception we tell ourselves in the early stages of healing, that once we see the truth we will feel free, that the veil will lift and with it the weight will fall. And in some ways it does. But what we do not expect, what no one warns us of, is the ache that comes with knowing, because clarity costs. It costs the version of the story you once clung to, the one where they didn't mean it, where maybe it was your fault, where things would get better if only you were more patient, more forgiving, more quiet. It cost the belief that your love could redeem them. It cost the fantasy you built to survive the reality. And when that illusion breaks, it doesn't shatter cleanly. It falls in fragments, jagged, unexpected, and deeply personal. You grieve the years you gave, the moments you silenced yourself, the boundaries you betrayed in the name of keeping the peace. You grieve the you who twisted herself into someone unrecognizable just to be acceptable to someone who would never truly accept you. You grieve not just what you lost, but what you were never allowed to become. And that grief is heavy, holy, honest, because it means you are finally telling the truth, not just about them, but about you. You are facing the unbearable reality that what you called love was, in many moments, manipulation, that what you endured was not a test of faith, but a slow erosion of your spirit, that your silence wasn't strength, it was survival. And now that you are no longer surviving but awakening, you feel it all. This is why healing is not linear, why some days feel like flight and others like falling. Because you are not just walking away from a person. You are burying a belief. You are laying to rest the version of you who thought, if I just love harder, they will change. But dear heart, your love was never the problem. Your love was holy. It was brave. It was real. It just wasn't received. And that is not your shame. That is their poverty. Because real love cannot be received by a heart that refuses to be honest. And the narcissist is not honest, not with you and not with themselves. They do not want love. They want control. And when you gave love instead, they called it weakness. But love was never your weakness. It was your witness. And now, in the morning that clarity demands, you begin to rediscover its purpose. Because grief, though crushing, is also clarifying. It burns away delusion. It sanctifies what remains. It shows you what was real and what was never yours to carry. You are not grieving the loss of love. You are grieving the realization that you were the only one who offered it. And though that truth cuts deep, it also sets you free. Because in the ruins of the illusion, something holy remains, a soul that did not die, though it was nearly extinguished, a soul that now rises, not in denial, not in bitterness, but in truth. And truth, though it breaks the heart, also begins to heal it. But as your grief clarifies, so too does their reaction. Because while you mourn the loss of illusion, they mourn the loss of control. The narcissist's desperation is not about love. It's about exposure. When you leave, they don't panic because they've lost you. They panic because they've lost the shadow you used to stand in. The narcissist does not love in the way you hoped. Not in the way love was designed to reflect the image of God. Sacrificial, honest, holy. No. Theirs is a love of utility, of consumption, of control disguised as closeness. And when you walk away, not in rage but in revelation, you remove the mirror that sustained their illusion. And that to them is existential terror. You see, they needed you, but not in the way lovers or friends need one another. They needed your silence to shield their dysfunction, your forgiveness to baptize their patterns, your belief in their goodness to preserve their performance. Because narcissists do not live in truth. They live in narrative, and every narrative needs an audience. When you step off their stage, when you stop clapping for the show they call love, they are not left heartbroken. They are left unmasked. And what terrifies them is not abandonment, it's exposure. Because the person you were, the one who excused, who softened, who hoped against hope, that version of you allowed them to keep wearing their costume. But now, you've changed, and your clarity becomes dangerous. You see them now, and they see that you see them. And that, to the narcissist, is the death of the entire arrangement. So they scramble, not because they want to make amends, but because they want to reassemble the illusion. They reach out, not to reconnect, but to reattach the threads that are unraveling. They whisper apologies, promises, even poetry, but not from repentance, from desperation. Desperation not to lose your heart, but to recover your compliance. Because in your absence, the lie begins to collapse. And that collapse is not just emotional, it is structural, it is spiritual. The narcissist does not fear loneliness. They fear being known, known for the manipulation, the cruelty, the smallness of soul that could not hold real love without deforming it. And now, your absence becomes a testimony, a quiet proclamation that says, I saw it, I know what you are. And so they do what they have always done, they perform. Only now the performance is no longer about seduction, it's about preservation. They will paint themselves the victim, so that others may mourn what you exposed. They will cast you as cruel, unstable, heartless, not because it's true, but because they must make someone pay for the mirror being shattered. They will use nostalgia as a weapon. Don't you remember how good it was? But memory is not truth, and your truth is stronger now than their revisionism. Because here is the divine irony. The very control they held over you was not physical, it was psychological. It was the power to define reality. And now that you've taken back the pen, they no longer get to write the story. They do not know how to live in a world where you are free, because in their world, your freedom was never an option, it was a threat. And so they rage, they plead, they spin, but none of it is about reconnection. It's about rewriting. They do not want reconciliation, they want re-entry into the space where they once ruled unchallenged. But that kingdom has fallen, and they know it, because the moment you stopped orbiting their delusion, you became something they cannot manipulate. A witness, and a witness is dangerous, not because they speak, but because they know. And what you know now, about yourself, about them, about love and freedom, cannot be unlearned. They didn't expect you to survive without them. They never imagined you'd thrive. and that is the agony they cannot outrun. And yet, what they fear even more than your absence is your awareness, because they never truly held you captive. They only held the story you believed. They never controlled you. They controlled the story you believed about yourself. The most devastating prison is not built of stone. It is built of stories, quiet, whispered tales about who you are, what you deserve, and how much is too much to hope for. You were never chained. You were narrated. From the beginning, the narcissist did not seek to dominate your body. They sought to colonize your belief. They didn't need to lock you in a cage because they found a way to make you question the key in your own hand. Their power was not in what they took from you, but in what they convinced you to surrender. They studied your soul, not to nourish it, but to edit it. They saw your longing for love and told you it was neediness. They saw your compassion and called it weakness. They saw your desire to make peace and shaped it into submission. And they rewrote the story of your worth, line by line, until their version sounded more believable than your own. That was their greatest illusion, not that they loved you, but that your value depended on their love. And so you began to live inside that script. You apologized for your strength. You questioned your instincts. You downplayed your pain. You told yourself you were too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. Not because it was true, but because they needed you to believe it was. You internalized their chaos. You made excuses for their absence. You carried their shame like it was your inheritance. And slowly, without knowing, you abandoned yourself. Not in one great betrayal, but in 1,000 tiny silences. But here is the miracle. Even distorted stories cannot kill the truth forever. The image of God within you is imperishable. Buried, yes. Forgotten, maybe, but not erased. And when the awakening began, when clarity pierced through the fog, it was not just them you began to see, it was you. The real you. The unedited version. The soul God made before the world taught you to apologize for it. And in that moment, the lie lost its grip. You realized the voice in your head that said, "You're not enough," didn't come from God. It came from someone who needed you to feel small so they could feel secure. You realized that your empathy is not a liability, it's a gift. That your sensitivity is not your curse, it's your compass. That your desire for peace was never weakness, it was the echo of eternity calling you back to truth. You were never theirs to define. They did not make you, and now they cannot unmake you, because what has been remembered cannot be rewritten. You have taken back the pen, and for the first time in a long time you are writing a story that begins not with survival, but with sovereignty. You are no longer asking, "Am I too much?" You are declaring, "I will never be less than I was created to be." The spell is broken, and in its place stands something far more powerful than rage or revenge. You, holy, and now that you've taken the pen back into your own hands, they resort to their last strategy, rewriting the narrative for everyone else. They rewrite the narrative because they can no longer reach you. When they lose control of your spirit, they reach for the next best thing, control over your story. You see, the narcissist was never truly connected to you, only to the version of you that obeyed the rules of their illusion. When that version disappears, they feel it not as loss, but as betrayal, and betrayal demands revenge. Not always loud, not always public, but always strategic. They begin to reshape the narrative, not just to soothe their ego, but to salvage the image that gave them power. Because your awakening doesn't just unsettle their inner world, it threatens to unveil their true nature to others. and the narcissist cannot survive unmasked. So they speak in half-truths, they drop carefully placed suggestions, they rewrite the past in soft tones and concerned eyes. They've changed, they'll say. They're not the person I knew. Something's off. They'll speak of you not with anger, but with disappointment. Because disappointment sounds reasonable. It sounds human. But make no mistake, this is not mourning, it is marketing. They craft a version of the story in which they are misunderstood, mistreated, martyred, and you are cast as unstable, cold, vindictive, not because it's true, but because the truth is unbearable to them. Because if people believe your side, they'll have to question theirs. And so they spin, they triangulate, they gather others like actors in a new production, friends, family, even your own children if they can, each one a pawn to reinforce the version of events that places them at the center as the wounded protagonist. But you must understand, they are no longer fighting for you. They are fighting for themselves, for the scaffolding that held up their entire self-image. They are trying to repair a crumbling edifice with borrowed credibility. Because they can no longer reach you directly. You have stepped out of range, not just physically, but spiritually, not just emotionally, and so their campaign moves around you. They do not call to connect, they speak so others will call you. They do not seek truth, they spread confusion, hoping you will spiral back into self-doubt. Because if they cannot make you feel small, they will try to make you look small. It is their last weapon, perception. But perception is not truth, and a lie, no matter how often repeated, cannot rewrite what God has revealed in you. You are no longer available to be narrated. You are no longer vulnerable to their distortion, because your identity is not a rumor, it is rooted, not in their approval, not in their pity, but in the unchanging truth of who you are, a soul remembered, reclaimed, and rebuilt in light. Let them rewrite their version. Let them perform, for those still asleep. You do not owe rebuttal. You do not need defense. Because when you live in truth, time becomes your testimony. And in time, the truth always outlives the tale. But even as they perform for those still asleep, you have stepped into something far greater than escape. You have stepped into authorship. Your freedom is the beginning of your real story. Freedom, when it first arrives, does not feel like victory. It feels like silence, like waking from a long and vivid dream, like standing at the edge of a life you once called love and realizing it was mostly survival. It feels disorienting, hollow, sacred, because freedom is not a single moment. It is a long remembering, a day-by-day reintroduction to the truth of who you are. You thought the story ended when you left, but in truth that was only the final page of their story. Now at last your story begins. Not the edited version you performed inside their illusion, not the survival tale written in whispered apologies and lost sleep, but the real one, the one God authored before the foundations of the world, the one that does not require shrinking to be accepted or silence to be safe, the one where love is not a transaction but a holy exchange between two souls that recognize the imago Dei in each other. The narcissist never imagined you would walk this far. They never planned for your healing. They never factored in your clarity. They never thought you would stop living in their story and start writing your own. But here you are. And the strength they mistook for fragility, the voice they tried to silence, the faith they mocked as weakness, these are the very things now rising to guide you forward. Not bitter, not broken, but anchored. You no longer carry the weight of needing them to understand. You are no longer waiting for closure that will never come, or for validation from the very hands that erased you. Because what you needed was never their apology. What you needed was your permission. And now, having given it, you live. You speak with clarity. You walk with peace. You love without losing yourself. You set boundaries without shame, and you do not bend anymore, just to prove your worth. Because you know, deep in your bones, that your worth is not something that must be earned or defended. It is inherent. It is sacred. It is yours. And though you carry scars, and you will, you also carry wisdom. You also carry light. You carry the testimony that not all who walk through darkness come out bitter. Some emerge brighter. Some, like you, walk out not to curse the past, but to bless the future. So write, beloved. Write the story the darkness never saw coming. Write it with honesty. Write it with tears if you must. But above all, write it with your whole, holy, unedited voice. Because this time, the story is yours,